Hello again, my name's Andre, and you'll remember that in our discussions of argument and discursive writing, we've looked at common sense quite a lot. What we're going to do now is go one step further. And in order to do that, I want you to remember the discussion we had on fallacy. So, what we're going to do today is very closely look at this concept, the fallacy. A fallacy is an error in logic leading to invalid conclusions. Now remember that there are two types of fallacy. The one is where the claim is not relevant, and then the second is where the claim is ambiguous. Right, so what we're looking at is making serious errors in logic, and of course we're hoping to avoid those. The first type, the fallacy of relevance, is when what you have claimed bears no relation to your conclusion. You're not connecting the two. And again, the fallacy of ambiguity is where what you have claimed to be the proof, in fact, has two meanings. Now, in either of these cases, we're not going to persuade anyone. Our arguments need to be clear and logically connected. Let's look closely at the fallacies of relevance. Here are a few major errors in logic. First one, appeal to force or pity or authority. Second one, abusive argument. Third one, generalization. Fourth, irrelevant conclusions. And the fifth, begging the question. What I'll do now is take you through these one by one, starting with the appeal to force. For example, you might say, pay me back or I'll hit you. You've not appealed to any sort of logic and connectedness. All you've done is threaten someone. That kind of argument bears no validity. Let's look now at the second type, the appeal to pity. For example, you may say, we can't send him to jail, he's only 14. What you've done here is played on that emotion that all of us have, that, well, really, the child's young, he can't be blamed for his actions. But it's not a valid argument. In fact, if you're 14 or 34, you ought to be taking some responsibility for your actions. The third type, which we need to look at, is an appeal to authority. Now, advertisers like this one. You may want something like, use Lux soap, Mr. Mandela uses it. Now, much as we respect Mr. Mandela and like him, he's a great politician, he really doesn't know much more about soap than either you or I would. So obviously, that appeal to an authority is not relevant to the conclusion you're making. Because Mr. Mandela uses the soap, we necessarily wouldn't have to. The next error is that called an abusive argument. I think many of us have been caught in the trap of using this style of argument. We say something like, anyone who thinks that must be an idiot. So that what we've done is not address the argument, we've just attacked and insulted the person. The next one is the generalization. An example of this would be, a tree was smashed by a drunk driver yesterday. All alcohol should be banned. Now think about the lack of logic in that. Just because one drunk driver smashed into one tree, all alcohol should be banned. It's clear that this is a generalization which is absolutely not logical. Our next fallacy is that of the irrelevant conclusion. Let's use the same example. A tree was smashed by a drunk driver yesterday. All cars should be banned. Now do you see that we've gone one step further? We've made the conclusion absurd. It's ridiculous. Cars can certainly not be blamed for the actions of that drunk driver. And then our final and probably most complicated logical fallacy. It's called begging the question. Here's an example. Be home at 6. Why? Because. But why? Because I said so. But why? Because I said that 6 is your curfew. Right, so now we've looked at fallacies of relevance. And the second type are called fallacies of ambiguity. Now, there's no doubt that these are a lot easier to deal with because, well, they sound really stupid. In fact, most of them are just completely silly. Here's an example. Each part of this truck weighs less than 1 kilogram. This must be a very light truck. It's clear that there are two meanings here. Certainly what the writer intended was to say to us, well, there's a truck made up of components, and each of those components weighs less than 1 kilogram. But what it sounds like, here's the stupid part, it sounds as if every piece of the truck on a scale all at once weighed together less than 1 kilogram. This last interpretation was ridiculous. And you see that that's where the problem lies. When you're dealing with fallacies of ambiguity, that ambiguity creates many levels of meaning, 2, 3 meanings sometimes. And by using this double meaning, this triple meaning, no one's actually sure what you're saying. So that if you use that sort of statement as proof for your argument, you're actually never going to be conclusive. No one is going to follow your logic. In fact, your common sense element has disappeared altogether. Let's look at a recap of what we've done in this lesson. Right, so in this lesson, we looked at fallacies, this idea that there are major errors in argument which we can sometimes make. We started with the fallacies of relevance. They were an appeal to force, pity, or authority, also the abuse of argument, generalizations, making irrelevant conclusions, and begging the question. Immediately after that, we looked at ambiguity and came to the conclusion that what we ought to try not to do is to use ambiguous double meanings in order to prove our arguments. We really decided that the conclusions you draw from this ambiguity are never valid. They never make common sense. Right, so now, when you try your next piece of discursive writing or your next piece of argument, make a serious attempt to avoid all of these fallacies. In fact, start noticing those fallacies in the language, the advertising, the articles you read. And in fact, once you're aware of them, you'll be surprised at how quickly your own ability to persuade improves. That's all we're doing today. Goodbye.